imagine going to sleep and waking up and you had a bunch of, your whole 401k, whatever, everything was invested in the stock market. And then you go to sleep, wake up the next day, and you're 22% poor.
It's another CtrlAltInvest. I'm your host, Jason Vondersmith. We're here resetting wealth creation, financial markets. It's not just me. It's me and James Goodwillie. James, what's up?
Not much. Another nice week, nice spring week.
You love dropping hints on when we're recording.
Yeah, but I didn't say the day today.
You didn't.
Which is good.
But
I'm learning.
You've really narrowed it down to a 3-month span. This could have been recorded in a 3-month span.
Yeah.
Today is a great topic. We have a lot that we want to dive into. We're going to talk about markets, what makes a market, and there's so much to unpack here. That's why I was having trouble with the lead-in, because there's not any one way to.
It's a broad stroke, or this is going to be the broad stroke of markets, as opposed to like diving really, really deep into the intricacies of a certain type of market, I would say.
Yeah, I feel like when you say market, and this is a podcast on finance, wealth,
yeah,
with a little bit of econ here and there.
Yeah.
The knee jerk when you hear market is you go right to stock market.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the natural place to start. Why don't you, because you are so well versed in history, hit me with some genesis, the genesis of the stock market. We like to go back to day one.
Yeah.
And I think we've done this before. We did have a conversation once about the first person who ever walked in and said, I will take one share. How did that work?
There's a bunch of different markets. I think you have labor, you've got commodities, you've got stock market, you've got services, all these different markets. But in terms of the stock market in general, and each one of those from a history standpoint came about at different times. But I think to understand the stock market first, let's mention like what a market is, right? In its simplest form, a market is simply just a place where things are exchanged between people. Mm-hmm. So in the stock market in particular, it's where shares of companies are exchanged between people. So if we take a step back and say, when did that happen? When was the first time that a company said, we'll let the public own pieces of our company? That goes back to early 1600s and like 1602, actually, in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, by a company called, that I'm sure everyone listening has heard of before in their 6th grade history class, maybe, the Dutch East India Trading Company.
I think you're giving a lot of credit to our educational system. I've heard of it. It rings a bell. I couldn't tell you what it is. It does sound familiar.
Dutch East India Trading Company. Their premise was, we're going to raise a ton of money. And you was right. Take a step back. This is the height of exploration, right? So you have Spain, France, Italy, all these places were putting explorers on ships and traveling the world. The Dutch East India Trading Company decided, let's raise a ton of money. Let's put people on these ships and let's go to Asia. That will allow us to get all the different goods and spices and eventually people from those locations. And we will bring it here and we will trade it and make a boatload of money. So that's essentially how they did it, right? They said, we need a ton of money. We can't just go to banks and kings and queens and all that to get this money. Maybe we should raise it from the people. And so they created this idea of, let's sell pieces of our own company to the people, share our profits with them. So as we make more money, they make more money by owning a piece of our company. That will allow us to raise a lot of capital.
That's amazing. So they were the first shareholders.
Yeah. So that was the first, that was kind of the first market per se from a stock perspective, if you want to use that term. And then pretty soon after, I think it was like later 1600s, the London Stock Exchange was formed.
In the 1600s?
Yeah.
I would have lost that bet. That's incredible. Let's take a small step back. We, on this pod, like to, we are resetting thoughts and maybe helping people question the status quo. I want to be very careful that we are not anti-markets.
Mm-hmm.
That would make us communist,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And I just finished that. There's a 9-part series on Netflix on the Cold War. It's called The Turning Point and the Cold War, something like that. Incredible.
Was it?
Oh my God.
Documentary type thing?
Yeah. If you want to understand I guess it was about 9 or 10 hours total. If you want to understand the Russian-Ukraine war, if you want to understand why we're at where we're at in history, you watch that. It does such a good job. It doesn't go too far into things. First few episodes are about like the nuclear weapons and the nuclear like building up an arsenal. But it finishes with cut-ins of what's happening with Russia and Ukraine and why that's so important to them. The reason I bring that up is you described the first shareholder, you described first stock market. Let's give that some context by saying here's what it's not. What would a market in a communist country like Russia look like? Because it's not based on free trade, right? It's set prices by the government.
Yeah. And so I think I'd say China in today's society, it's probably more China that operates like that. Yeah, it's you're exactly right. It's set essentially by the government, right? Like, and you can look at past companies, recent companies that people listening to this are probably familiar with and realize exactly what that does, right? Alibaba, perfect example. Alibaba came from nothing and grew into one of the biggest companies in the world solely because China deemed them to be worth that.
Okay, perfect. So they said this is a company worth X dollars.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense to me. And just kind of nailing that home, and also a spoiler alert for that documentary, when Putin came in, same sort of deal where maybe it was a couple, maybe it was Yeltsin or somewhere in that time frame between Yeltsin and Putin. Same sort of thing. They took private companies back, gifted it to oligarchs. Never mind. I'm not going to say that. I was going to drop an Elon Musk in there, but we'll get roasted if we try that.
Yeah. No. You're exactly right. You're bringing them, and Russia still does that to this day, right? I mean, that's one of Putin's biggest legacies is the fact that, on paper he's not worth but so much money, but if you look at all the numbers, he's worth like probably more money than anyone on planet Earth, simply because he took all of his buddies or people he could trust and made them the heads of these state-controlled, quasi-state-controlled public companies, such as their oil companies or shipping or whatever. And China does the same thing, right? I mean, China, if you're a publicly traded company in China, you have to have a member of the Communist Party on your board. Can you imagine that? Imagine that. Imagine being like,
I can't.
Imagine if Donald Trump put a law into place and was like, from now on, every publicly traded company has to have a Republican on the board.
I don't think we're far off. I don't have to imagine. We don't have to imagine too far. It doesn't seem, if we're not careful. No, and I can't. And I say I can't because I was thinking about that as I was finishing the documentary. They went into that exact point that Putin wants to talk about. He's doing all this stuff for the fatherland, Russia. And the point was, no, he's doing it for money. And every action was about money.
Yeah. And I think that's a big difference between, and obviously Putin's not a communist, and he publicly says he dislikes communists. He is 100% an oligarch. He cares probably more about money, I'd say, than his counterpart in China, right? Who does care about China. He wants China to be the number one biggest superpower on planet Earth. And I don't necessarily think Putin thinks that way anymore. He might have early on, but I think now he's like, money.
Yeah. And so that helps us bring it back home. Money. That's what drives all these markets. We started with stock market. There's a million, right? And again, I'm just trying to draw a box around how we can think about markets, because when you talk about wealth creation, there is a million markets you can participate in to try and build that. Some of them are more straightforward than others. Do you think it's fair? Do you think it's a worthwhile exercise? Maybe start talking about the different kinds of markets.
Yeah, I think it's good. Early history, BC era, the markets were all just bartering systems, right? It was still a market, right? It was still goods being exchanged by people or something being exchanged by people. But it was double-sided in the sense that like both parties had to have what each other wanted, right? If I wanted a goat and you wanted some corn, we would both need to want what each other has in order to make that exchange. And so I think the introduction of money, we just mentioned that being the key piece here. The introduction of a currency kind of changed everything in the sense of like now all that person needs that's selling it just needs to want the money, and everyone has the money. So that becomes the standard. And so from there, fast forward thousands of years, we end up with the gazillion markets that we have now. So we have, real estate, you have labor, you have services, you have commodities, you have financial, like with stocks and bonds and all that. You have the cryptocurrency market. You have, you name it. It's out there.
Yeah. I was kind of hoping we could put a box around it, but you really can't. You can't sit there. You sit there for 2 hours rolling off different markets you can participate in.
Yeah.
But I think you nailed it in that it used to be, like you said, I need this, I need that. And if you didn't have what I needed, but Tom over there had what I needed, I had to trade with you, then go trade with him.
Exactly.
And that was a life skill. Now everyone needs money. And so any one of these markets, do you think it's become bastardized by that? That instead of trading for what we need, it's all just a market. Maybe we go back to the stock market for this particular point. It's a market that's focused solely on the collection of money.
Yeah. I mean, back in the day, I think it's become so bastardized by money. And I'll explain here in a second why. Early on, the stock market was a genius idea, right? The public, instead of the uber rich, the general public can buy companies that they like. And we've talked about this a lot, right? Like if you like a company, you like the product they make, you could buy a piece of that company and make money off of that company as they make money and as they do better. That's a cool idea. That's a great idea, right? It leads to innovation. It leads to all kinds of positive change because it allows the broad public to support certain companies and share in the bounty of that company. But what's happened now is the stock market has evolved into and warped into this entity where money is the market, not the companies. The companies are just the face. But at the end of the day, the bottom line of all of this is money's the market. The market is just the money. That's why you have options. That's why you have futures. And that's why you have all these different ways to make money off of the money as opposed to making money off of the company.
That's right. And I can hear our listeners saying, well, I don't know that that's true. I still get to, like you said, share in the bounty of a company.
Yeah.
Let's say that I'm looking to invest. We all agree investing at its core is a way to build wealth.
Mm-hmm.
What you invest in obviously matters, but we do agree in that mechanism, which is allowed because of markets.
Yeah.
Right. So if I'm investing in this one market, the stock market, and I can hear somebody disagreeing with you saying, no, because I get to, it's not just about money. Obviously, it creates money, it creates wealth, but I can participate in these, what the companies are doing. How has the stock market done, if we look at like between the 90s and close to today? If I were to disagree with you, would I have a point, you think?
In a certain way, I think, but it still just comes down to money and who has the most money. And it has nothing to do with the actual company and what they're producing in terms of the value that gets brought to the table. The value is the money, not what they're making, which back in the day, it was what they were making and how much money they were bringing in. As more money is entered, you get these rapidly inflated things that then cause crashes and things like that, right? So everyone's heard of like Black Monday, I'm sure, or a lot of people have, where in 1987, I believe it was, 22% of wealth of the market was eliminated in a single day.
Why?
Just panic, right? Just overinflated prices, and everybody institutional money and everybody and retail just, which is the average person, just pulled out. So imagine going to sleep and waking up and you had a bunch of, your whole 401k, whatever, everything was invested in the stock market. And then you go to sleep, wake up the next day, and you're 22% poor.
And not, again, to hammer it home, not because what GM was selling was any less valuable or less useful, or a new technology was introduced that changed demand for a product. It was just because of people exiting any one market.
Yeah. To further that point of like that money doesn't influence the innovation, I think to further that point, you could look at what people call the lost decade, right? So the lost decade was 2000 to 2010, where the return from the stock market was negative 2.5%. For a decade in the early 2000s, if you had your money in the stock market, you lost 2.5% throughout that time. Did innovation stop? No. Think about all the amazing companies that were created or grew, right? I mean, Apple was technically on the stock exchange then, and Apple in 2010 was a behemoth. The innovation was still there. The products were still there. The sales were still growing, but the money just didn't like it.
This is something I think about way more often than I probably should. But if you go back to, I don't want to go to a dark place, but 9/11 is a good pivot point because everybody kind of remembers where they were at that time.
Yeah.
I was in college then, and I did not have an iPhone. I did have a cell phone, but it was very rudimentary, and you had to move around and get the signal, and it didn't have a camera. It didn't have a video camera. It wasn't shooting in 4K. And you're right. That's a decade in which massive innovation occurred, and the market didn't pay off. Now, you said that it lost 2.5%.
Yeah.
Is that just poof into thin air? Where does that money go? If I was in the stock market, I had $100,000. Well, I'm going back to Black Monday now. I had $100,000.
Okay.
And I woke up the next day, and you said 22%. So now I have $78,000.
Yeah.
Where did that money go?
Into the pockets of people playing in the money market as opposed to the stock market, right? So the people just that were trading in that and using that to their advantage, using money to make more money, and the way they were doing that is just off of stocks as opposed to like product or a company or anything like that. It went into their pockets.
There's another market. What is a money market? Give me the high level on that.
What I'm describing is technically the stock market, but there are money markets where you can essentially, the long and short of it is you're like lending your money to be guaranteed a certain amount of money later down the road. And so it's essentially they borrow the public's money to do what they want. No, so they're a little different. When I say the money market, like there is an actual money market, and then you also have like currencies and stuff, but there is an actual market for money. But what I'm talking about is just kind of like the stock market is now just a quasi money market.
Well, it's a casino.
Yeah, true.
Maybe we can just go with that, call it what it is.
Yep.
Yeah, we can call it what it is. It's a casino. They're the defenders of that market. And again, I want to move outside this market soon. Bitcoin will be a good market to get into. Labor market will be a good market to get into because it, good comparison, contrast to what we're talking about. The defenders of the stock market will say, well, and specifically to what you're talking about, whether it's options trading or whatever, they're going to say, well, I'm a market maker. I provide liquidity. And they're not wrong in that if I'm looking, let's use CarMax as an example. CarMax provided tons of liquidity to the used car market, right? It used to be buying a car was a huge deal. When you were in, you were in.
Yeah.
And maybe you could sell it private party, maybe you could go trade it in, but it wasn't fast, it wasn't easy. You had to find a buyer yourself, you had to value it. Now it's very much like they've got the prices nailed, right? There's not a ton of movement. And even if you go to buy a car from even not CarMax, no one's negotiating because they've sort of figured out an efficient system.
Yep.
CarMax is a market maker for that. They say, I'm going to hold all this inventory of cars so that when somebody comes along and needs a car, the transaction is so easy. That's why people love it. So in the stock market, that's kind of similar with the people that will hold stocks for when somebody comes along and wants to buy one, or even the options traders. And they say, you know what, I'm a market maker. I'm providing liquidity. But I think what's missed in that point of like patting yourself on the back is that you're providing liquidity to a market that maybe doesn't need to exist anyways. That's all. That's like you said, it's not, I want to own Apple. Now it's like, how can I arbitrage and options with another stock and whatever, just to poof, either make money appear or disappear.
Yeah, that was a perfect segue into the casino analogy, right? Because it is that, right? With options and futures and things like that. It's a gamble, right? You're saying, I think the price is going to be this. It's this right now, but I think it's going to be this. How does that have anything to do with the actual performance of a company, right? I guess you could make the argument of like, well, I see that iPhone sales are probably going to drop next quarter, or I have this or this knowledge or whatever, so I think this is going to happen. Okay, but that removes the entire point of a stock market, and the original creation of like, you believe in our company, you should buy a little piece of it, and you will share in our profits, right? That because now, to my earlier point, it's and yours, it's a casino of money, right? It has nothing to do with the actual performance.
Here's a good one. Is participating in the stock market a skill game? And follow-up question, because the answer is obviously yes. Do we want it that way?
So yes, it is. And no, I don't think I want it that way.
And here's a good way to look at that. Again, going back to the early 2000s, if you remember the poker boom, we talked with our a previous guest, Vinod, who is an accomplished poker player. A lot of people highly skilled at poker. If you ever watched the movie Rounders, which was a college favorite, there's a famous scene where he's like, why do the same 5 people make it to the final table every year? It's not a game of luck. It is a game of skill. When the poker boom was happening, there was millions of online sites. Not millions, that's a ridiculous sentence. There was 5 or 10 online sites.
Yeah, big ones. Yeah.
You could go play with millions of people. The government shut that down. Not one, because they weren't getting their cut. That's why they shut that down.
Ding, ding, ding.
Right. But that is widely acknowledged as a skill game. I believe in my hand, and based on what I've observed in the course of this one hand, my hand's better than yours, and I'm betting that money. That's where we're at with the stock market. And if we want it that way, that's fine. But again, that's not what the genesis or the intention of that stock market was.
Yeah. Going back to your point about the market makers, right? And these people that like to say that, we help make markets and provide liquidity and things like that. I understand where they're coming from, right? I understand that from a technical aspect, you might be able to make the case of like, it allows farmers to hedge against the future price of corn, or it allows oil companies to hedge against the future price of oil and things like that so that they don't get, slaughtered in certain environments. But at the end of the day, I think the only reason it allows for them to hedge is because of how aggressively and temperamental that market is. Whereas if that didn't exist, the market wouldn't be as temperamental and wouldn't move nearly as much or as fast, probably.
Yeah.
Right. So it's to your earlier point. I think if it's this self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. All right, so let's move on to the labor market. That seems straightforward enough, where I'm going to go participate, and here's a skill I have. I'm going to go dig a hole, as it were.
Yep.
Get a job at Apple, whatever it might be. Give me your high level of what a labor market is, what it looks like, and how it might compare to stock market.
So for the labor market, you can't necessarily trade in the labor market like you can with stocks, right? But it is still a market. So it is goods, and in this case, it's people. So it's something that's being traded between people or organizations, and so that's people. It's labor, and so the labor market in general is just that. It's just jobs, people who are employed in what industries, and so forth.
Perfect. And that's what I was going to say was that's sort of the outcome of a labor market is money, because you go to work to make money. And again, every market is going to be at least intertwined somehow with money. But it's a little more nuanced than that, right? Because as a culture, a society, a country, if no one participated in the labor market, what do you got?
Yeah. A dead country.
Yeah, there's nothing to be had. Somebody's got to farm the land. Someone's got to make the widgets.
Yeah, you end up with a almost like a utopian society where everyone kind of goes back to the older days of where you barter, you grow the food just for your own consumption, and you're not selling it. And if you are selling it, it's just to fulfill the empty needs that you have as a family, right? So if I'm growing all my corn and I need whatever, I need a piece of jewelry, then I could go to my buddy who's making a piece of jewelry and get it that way, right? But it doesn't provide money.
It provides a lot of value. The labor market provides a lot of value. If I'm going to participate in a market, is it fair to say that I can choose to participate in the labor market or the stock market, or?
No, from like an investing standpoint, or like a
Sure.
not really. Like I said, you can't really trade the labor market. I mean,
no, sorry. I mean, with my time, like I can choose with my time, I can invest myself in the labor market, right?
Oh,
when
yeah.
when I go to work every day, I'm in the labor market.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And you can hire employees, which is contributing to the labor market, right? If you build a business or whatever.
And then prices. See, so this, I feel like this is a great contrast to the stock market because it seems, and you tell me if I'm wrong, as a very fair way to set prices. If I'm in the labor market and I work for company A and they're paying me $50,000 a year, but I have a skill that company B wants and company B is just getting started and they're offering 60, company A can either match that or I go over to company B. That's a little bit different from when we talk about the fluctuations in stock prices based on things that don't matter or things that haven't actually impact the underlying asset. It seems a bit more fair. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, back when stocks were tied to the performance of a company and what they produced and the trajectory of it, when you invested in the stock market, you indirectly invested in the labor market, but not anymore.
Not anymore. If I'm a market participant, how do I know what market to get into? Again, we're talking about building wealth. We've talked about real estate as one of the most solid, traditional, repeatable, I'm not going to say never failed, but operates in a somewhat predictable manner.
Mm-hmm.
I can go get an education in that. Where do I learn who can teach me about entering and exiting markets, right? If I want to be an options trader, I guess I got to learn something. If I want to participate in the labor market, what do I got to do? Go listen to like Grant Cardone or something?
I guess you could. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, you could get an education from the 10X guru, Grant Cardone.
So how do I 10X my market participation, you think?
By learning it, right? You have to, that's step one, learn it, understand it. And I think that's to determine where you want to go next or where you want to go. That's step number one, right? And I think because of how convoluted the stock market is and how complex it is and how you are to your, just to use the reference of the casino, you're playing against the house, right? You're playing against the multi-billionaires, the multi-billion-dollar hedge funds that have massive amounts of capital, right? So if you're getting into an options trading and you're going to go short something, if you have $100,000 and this hedge fund wants to squeeze your short to make more money off of your $100,000, they're just going to bull rush you and strong arm whatever they want, right? Doesn't matter. So you better have a lot of other friends that are also shorting it so that you don't get screwed. Yeah. So I think, but in the real estate one, it's not necessarily that complex, and it also doesn't move as fast, right? Like even in 2008, it's not like Black Monday where everything crashes over 20% in a 24-hour time frame. Even 2008, it took over a year for that decline to happen.
Yeah. Get rich slow scheme, as we've talked about. Yeah. And for those who that might sound complicated too, you talk about short. Short is it's a bet against, you're betting against something.
Yeah.
That's what it means to be short. In 2008, if you watched The Big Short, he bet against the mortgage market.
Yes.
And then he made a lot of money. So if you're shorting something, you are betting against something happening. You are absolutely right. We talk about agency and we talk about fair play. That is not a fair game. You can, as a billionaire, as a hedge fund, market manipulation, I can force you out. I can force your hand with whatever you're in, stock market wise, is where I'm going with this. Famous payback on that, you can look at GameStop. another Netflix documentary. They have that on there. That's interesting. Essentially, the underlying asset, GameStop, is a dying company. No one's walking into the store to buy their video game. It's all over the internet now. The big players bet they shorted that stock. They said, we are against that stock. You get on Reddit, you got Roaring Kitty and all these Reddit followers. They bought the stock. When they buy in that high quantity, it forces the hand of who's short. They have to cover that position. When you say cover that position, it just means that they're allowed to bet against it without actually having the stock. Now they have to go to market to get the stock. To do that, they have to buy it. More buying, price goes up, 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 up.
It's a very, very good point, right? Of the stock market nowadays is all about who has the upper hand. Again, the casino kind of play, right? Who has the better odds? And in the stock market, it's whoever has the most money. It's not necessarily who's the best company. It's just who has the most money to play with, right? And I think if Michael Burry, going back to The Big Short, if Michael Burry was the only one that was shorting the housing market, they may have been able to squeeze him. And then maybe that didn't happen, right? Obviously, the underlying basis of the housing market was failing, right? With all the, not to go into too many details, but the bullshit tranches of bullshit graded securities. Regardless, like if one guy was like, you know what, I think the housing market's gonna fail in the next 6 months. I'm gonna short it for $20 million. Nothing would have happened. But because Michael Burry said, I'm willing to bet over $1 billion or however much, I think it was close to that. And then a bunch of others said, I'll throw in 300 million. I'm good for 100 million on this. And then a couple others followed suit because they saw what Burry was doing. That created the pressure necessary for those guys to get filthy rich off of that short. Whereas GameStop, a little different.
How's he done since then, Michael Burry? Because he had one big event. He made that ton of money being right. He was absolutely right about that one thing.
Yes.
So he's obviously been right about everything since, correct?
Surprisingly close.
Okay.
He's had some flops, but he got out of that. He got out and started his own thing because it was just too hectic, too much. Obviously, he made a huge amount of money, but most of the money was made for the company that he was at, not necessarily himself in that regard. But he started his own thing. He's done okay. He made a lot of money off GameStop.
Let me challenge you a little bit, and I'm not well educated on this, but I'm almost certain that I saw he's been anti-market for maybe even since then. He's been calling for a crash, I think year over year for 10 years.
Yeah. So he's one of those guys, and even in The Big Short, if you've seen the movie, you'll notice how like they started hemorrhaging money because when you do a short, you have to essentially call the timeline that's going to happen. And when it doesn't hit, you have to pay for every single day that it doesn't hit, right? Or it doesn't start decreasing. So you have to your point of covering it, right? So Michael Burry the firm started to lose a lot of money because he was early in calling the crash. He's kind of followed suit in that. He's always been very early in calling for crashes or calling for market failures or calling for sectors and things like that. Like he was one of the ones, probably 5 years ago that was like, or maybe more, that was like China's going down. And everyone was like, you're insane. And then, last year, China's been going down. So he's not necessarily, I think he's just early in most cases.
That makes sense. I mean, I guess you're bordering, I guess if I say something long enough, it's bound to come true. And so I'm not trying to shit on Michael Burry.
Yeah.
I think what I'm trying to get at is everyone has a prediction. Everyone's right sometimes. Blind squirrel finds a nut. Clock's 12 o'clock twice a day. That doesn't necessarily denote being able to predict the future or know exactly what's going to happen. Because I got a secret for you. Nobody knows what's going to happen.
Yeah. Burry in particular is, and kind of going off the rails here, but Burry in particular is very good at understanding and learning about very complex things that people take for granted. And I think, if he was to go out there and say, I think NVIDIA is going to do well, it's like, okay, maybe. But when he starts talking about big complex things like mortgage-backed securities or, some sort of complex system, then I think people probably their ears perk up a lot because he's one of those weird guys that'll just sit there with binders and binders and binders of information and religiously study it until he has perfected the entire system.
And I love that. And this is a great segue because when we were talking about how do you know when to get into a market, I don't think you have to do what you're describing. For that market, you do. But you need to know what it takes to get in. I, like a lot of people who reconnected with their youth during the pandemic, got back into baseball cards.
Mm-hmm.
That was very fun, buying them up. That market sucks. I've got some cool stuff, some cool auto cards. I got some old stuff. Modern baseball cards we like to use the word scam. It's not a scam. It's just, you're collecting stuff.
Right.
But that market's very tough. There are cards that, like, if you go and get, get on YouTube. These guys will buy cases and cases of cards that get released. Now, I don't know if it's corrupt. How do you get them? I think you need a dealer license. So you have to become a dealer. Like, this is the education piece, right? You have to become a dealer. You can buy, Topps comes out with their Series 1. You buy cases and cases. You're looking for a one-of-one somebody. So if there's a good prospect that year, you pay more for the case. They sit there for 4 or 5 hours. People will watch this on YouTube, watching guys opening packs of cards. And there was a famous one not that long ago where a one-of-one Ellie De La Cruz got pulled, and I don't know how much money you're making, but
right.
All of that is to say you can get into any of these kind of markets. You just need to know what you're doing. So stock market, you're rolling over binders and binders of information. You have all this historical knowledge. Baseball cards, maybe you just need to watch 10 hours of somebody opening a pack of cards, and you can understand that market to some effect. Going back to your 10X buddy, Grant Cardone,
Mm-hmm.
if I want to get into a market, he says I just need to 10X my activity, right?
Yeah, I think that's his shtick.
So much of what we talk about is a pivot away from what you hear every day on social media. Why would we pivot away from? Because I think some of what he says is true. He talks about, he's got his little 5. I think he goes around saying there's 5 ways to build wealth.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, he goes around and says a lot of dumb shit.
Yeah.
This one I sort of agree with. This isn't one of the 5. He says that colleges are one of the biggest scams in history. Agree or disagree?
Originally disagree, but as of the last, I'd say 30 years, yeah, for sure agree.
Yes, modern history.
Yes.
For sure.
Yes.
He says there's 5 ways to build wealth. 1, you can inherit it. Sure.
Mm-hmm.
You can marry into it.
Yep.
Sure. You can just get lucky. Maybe you find it in the woods somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just
Powerball.
Cover your bases. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
right. Exactly. You can invest it, which he loves talking about,
Mm-hmm.
or you can start a company, go to work for a company, do something like that.
Yeah.
So those last 2, again, I think that's a decent way to sum it all up. When he talks about investing, just 10X, bro.
It's 10X. It's that simple.
So if you're investing in one stock, I'm buying 10, buddy. That's the thing, right?
Yeah.
So what market? I think he likes to. He calls colleges a scam. I'm fine with that. He participates in the education market too, doesn't he?
Yes. And maybe that's an interesting point. Maybe that's why he calls them a scam, because he wants people to go to the old Grant Cardone University.
Yeah. What's he selling?
10X.
10X. Yeah.
10X. Yeah. 10X your health, 10X your business, 10X your sales, 10X your family life, 10X whatever.
And this, yeah, exactly. If you've ever read that book, that's all it is. It's not. Maybe some of it's practical. I don't think it is. I've read the book. It is just chapter after chapter. He goes, if someone's running a mile, you run 10 miles, and then you get out your calculator and you go, oh yeah, that is 10 times.
Yeah.
So I want to end on this because we started with what markets are. Obviously, we focus heavily on the stock market. We tried to extrapolate that across all markets and when and where you might participate. We also like to throw the word scam around. What is actually a scam? What's great about our country is I can go out and sell my lemonade on the street, generally speaking. I can plant my flag on 10X. I can sell my 10X book. I can go to market with whatever product. Where do you draw the line with some of what he does? Because he's a salesman.
Right.
Donald Trump's dad was a salesman. These aren't people that are...
Mark Cuban is a salesman.
Mark Cuban, the salesman.
Mm-hmm.
We might need to come back to that later. We don't have time right now. What I'm getting at is, what is a market in our free trade society? If I'm having a hard time saying this out loud. if I want to sell you the magic pill, I've got this thing. It's just grass. It's grass, not weed.
Yeah.
I went out back in my backyard and I picked up a bunch of grass. And I say it cures headaches. And I go to market. Am I allowed to? Maybe that's not fair because of the FDA and
Sure.
whatever.
Yeah, but you don't need FDA approval, really, necessarily.
Yeah, if I go out and say, this is the cure-all, and coming back to Grant Cardone, he wants to help the middle class. I believe it to be true. I believe that he probably wants people like him who maybe don't have money, he wants them to have money. And so he sells this 10X course. Is that okay? Because what he's saying is not, there's not IP in there.
It's a very good point, and great question. I think the basis of it is, and the fine line that gets walked is, what is just marketing and what is a scam? There's a reason that market is in the word marketing.
I love it.
The product may not be better than the competitors, but you can market that product to where people want to buy that more than the competitors. That's fine. The product still works. The product is still a thing. It still does what it's supposed to do. Maybe it breaks more often or whatever. And I think that's the case in Grant Cardone's courses and things like that. Whereas a scam is something I would say that doesn't work at all. So your magic pill, it doesn't work. It's not actual medicine. It doesn't actually do its thing. In Grant Cardone's perspective, I would say it does work, but just maybe not for everyone, right? And so I think that's kind of the balance there.
Sure. And everything works, nothing doesn't. So if any sort of activity long-term will pay off in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And maybe we do a second part on markets, because I think what you're getting at is scam or not scam is, and what makes market goes, especially in a democracy, is guardrails around that market. There's a reason that people aren't supposed to have monopoly power. That's flown out the window. Of course, they have that now. The banks, as they try to consolidate over the years, there were supposed to be guardrails around the motivations of people in a market, or to make it fair. Free trade's great, laissez-faire, yes, except, and you need to have guardrails around that. We've gotten way far away from that. No, there's no one at the helm anymore, but there's so much more there. And I think, sadly, the modern America, the reason it's become so big and the reason we want to make it great again is because it's built around separating stupid people from their money. Yes or no?
Yeah, it's definitely one of the things. Yeah.
Yeah. Hot take at the end.
There you go.
What do you think? Round 2 on markets?
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. For now, CtrlAltInvest.